Isaiah has 66 chapters. Many Protestant Bibles contain 66 books. That numerical match has produced a famous claim. Isaiah is a miniature Bible, with 39 chapters reflecting the Old Testament and 27 reflecting the New. But there is a problem. Isaiah did not divide his scroll into 66 chapters. Those chapter numbers appeared many centuries later, and Jewish, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant traditions do not count the biblical books in the same way. Whatever makes Isaiah a key to the Bible, it cannot be a numerical code placed there by the prophet. Yet the book does something far more remarkable. It begins by summoning heaven and earth to witness Israel's rebellion. It ends with new heavens and a new earth. Between those horizons stand a holy king, a devastated vineyard, a promised child, a new Exodus, a suffering servant, a restored Zion, and nations gathering to worship. If the secret is not the number 66, what holds this enormous prophetic scroll together? And why does the rest of Scripture return to its images again and again? Isaiah's opening line places the vision during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. That setting carries the reader into the 8th century before Christ, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was expanding across the ancient Near East. Assyria did not merely defeat armies, it dismantled kingdoms, deported populations, demanded tribute, and used terror to break resistance. During Isaiah's lifetime, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria. Judah survived, but Jerusalem eventually faced an Assyrian army during Hezekiah's reign. Isaiah interprets this political danger through a larger question. Who truly rules the nations? Judah's kings can seek military alliances, count weapons, inspect water supplies, and send tribute. But Isaiah insists that Assyria itself remains beneath the authority of Israel's God. The empire is called the rod of divine anger, yet the rod boasts as though it were moving by its own strength. Isaiah compares that arrogance to an axe exalting itself over the person who swings it. This conflict between visible empire and invisible kingship shapes the first major movement of the book. Human rulers appear powerful, but Isaiah repeatedly exposes their limits. The king of Assyria cannot become divine because he conquers cities. The king of Judah cannot guarantee survival through wealth, diplomacy, or weapons. Even the faithful reforms of Hezekiah do not create a permanent solution. The decisive image appears in Isaiah's temple vision. In the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah sees the Lord seated upon a throne, high and lifted up. The earthly throne has lost its king. The heavenly throne has not become vacant. Seraphim call to one another, "Holy, holy, holy." The foundations shake, and the house fills with smoke. Isaiah does not respond as a confident prophet examining a vision. He pronounces judgment upon himself. He is a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips, and his eyes have seen the King. A burning coal from the altar touches his mouth. His guilt is removed, and his sin is atoned for. Only after cleansing does he answer the call to be sent. That sequence provides an early key to the whole scroll. The Holy King exposes uncleanness, the altar provides cleansing, and the cleansed messenger is commissioned to speak. Judgment, atonement, and mission are not separate themes placed beside one another. Each creates the need for the next. But Isaiah's commission introduces a disturbing complication. His preaching will not produce immediate national understanding. The people will hear without truly understanding and see without truly perceiving. The land will move toward devastation. When Isaiah asks, "How long?" the answer extends toward emptied cities and abandoned houses. Even then, the final image is not complete erasure. A felled tree leaves a stump, and the holy seed remains in the stump. That image will return. A kingdom will appear cut down. A dynasty will look like dead wood. Yet a shoot will emerge from the stump of Jesse. The book's hope does not grow from Judah's visible strength. It grows from what survives divine judgment. If you value investigations that stay close to the biblical text, subscribe and leave a comment naming the historical or textual detail that stood out so far. Thank you for joining this study. The reign of Ahaz places this conflict into a specific royal crisis. Aram and the northern kingdom of Israel attempt to pressure Judah into an alliance against Assyria. Ahaz fears that Jerusalem and the house of David may fall. Isaiah tells him to remain firm in faith and offers him a sign from God. Ahaz refuses the offer in language that sounds reverent. He will not test the Lord. But the surrounding narrative does not present this refusal as faith. Ahaz has already chosen a political path. The sign is announced anyway. A young woman will conceive and bear a son called Emmanuel, God with us. The prophecy first speaks inside Ahaz's crisis. Before the child reaches a certain stage of maturity, the two kings Ahaz fears will no longer pose the same threat. Yet Assyria, the power Ahaz trusts, will sweep into Judah like a flood. The sign therefore contains both assurance and warning. God remains with the house of David, but divine presence does not approve the king's unbelief. The chosen instrument of security will become an instrument of devastation. Isaiah then expands the child imagery. People walking in darkness see a great light. A child is born, a son is given, and authority rests upon him. His rule is connected with justice, righteousness, peace, and the throne of David. Later, a shoot rises from Jesse's stump, and the Spirit of the Lord rests upon him. The book has moved from a threatened child in the days of Ahaz to an ideal Davidic ruler whose reign transforms the land. An immediate sign has opened a much larger horizon. The narratives concerning Hezekiah intensify the pattern. Jerusalem is delivered from Assyria, and Hezekiah recovers from illness. But when envoys arrive from Babylon, he shows them his treasures, storehouses, and weapons. Isaiah announces that these riches and members of the royal household will one day be carried to Babylon. That announcement changes the historical horizon. Assyria has dominated the danger behind much of the earlier material. Now Babylon stands at the edge of the scroll. Then, without narrating Jerusalem's destruction or the long years of exile, the book suddenly declares, "Comfort, comfort my people." The reader has crossed from a threatened 8th century city into words addressed to a people for whom Jerusalem's punishment lies behind them and return from Babylon stands ahead. This shift has produced one of the central debates surrounding Isaiah. Many scholars understand chapters 40 through 55 as arising from the setting near the end of the Babylonian exile, and chapters 56 through 66 as reflecting the difficult period of restoration afterward. Traditional readings have emphasized Isaiah's predictive prophecy and the unity of the named prophet's vision. More recent literary approaches also ask how the final form joins these historical horizons into one book. The debate matters, but it does not erase the first literary fact. The scroll deliberately places Assyria, Babylon, exile, return, and final restoration within a single prophetic vision. So what binds these different horizons together? The answer begins where the book itself begins, not with its medieval chapter count, but with the witnesses Isaiah summons in his opening sentence, heaven and earth. Isaiah opens with words that sound like the beginning of a covenant trial. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. The same witnesses appear in the Song of Moses near the end of Deuteronomy. There, heaven and earth are summoned because Israel has entered a covenant whose blessings and judgments will outlive one generation. Isaiah deliberately returns to that language. Judah's crisis is not merely the result of weak diplomacy or stronger armies. The covenant people have rebelled against the God who formed them. The accusation begins inside a household. God has raised children, but they have turned against him. An ox knows its owner. A donkey recognizes its master's feeding place. Israel does not know. The people created to know God have become less responsive than the animals around them. Then the imagery changes. The nation becomes a wounded body, covered from foot to head with untreated injuries. The land becomes a devastated field. Jerusalem stands like a temporary shelter left behind after harvest. One opening chapter moves from courtroom to household, from body to field, and from city to sanctuary. That movement matters because Isaiah is not assembling unrelated religious themes. Rebellion against God produces corruption in worship, injustice in the city, and devastation in the land. These are different faces of one broken covenant. Sacrifices are still being offered. Festivals are still being observed. Prayers are still being spoken. Yet God rejects them because the hands lifted in worship are full of blood. The problem is not that sacrifice, Sabbath, or prayer has become meaningless. The problem is that ritual has been separated from the character of the God being worshipped. Isaiah therefore commands Judah to wash, remove evil, learn good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, and plead for the widow. Only then does the chapter present its famous invitation. Though sins are like scarlet, they may become white as snow. The offer of cleansing does not float above the accusations. It answers them. The holy God who exposes blood-stained hands also offers to make scarlet guilt white. This pattern reappears in Isaiah's temple vision. Unclean lips are exposed before the holy king. A coal from the altar touches those lips. Guilt is removed. The cleansed prophet is sent. Isaiah's opening chapter and his call are communicating vessels. Both move from exposure to cleansing, and from cleansing toward a renewed vocation. The vineyard song in Isaiah 5 deepens the charge. God prepares fertile ground, removes stones, plants choice vines, builds a watchtower, and cuts a winepress. Every reasonable preparation has been made. But the vineyard produces wild fruit. Then Isaiah identifies the vineyard as the house of Israel and the people of Judah. God expected justice, but found bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but heard a cry of distress. The Hebrew poetry intensifies the accusation through sound. The words for what God desired resemble the words for what he found, but their meanings are violently opposed. The fruit looks close enough to deceive from a distance. It is not the fruit God planted the vineyard to produce. This gives the book one of its governing questions. Can a vineyard that has produced bloodshed ever bear righteousness? Can a people who hear without understanding become witnesses? Can a city called unfaithful become a city of righteousness? Can a devastated land become a place where nations learn peace? One answer is that Isaiah is simply a collection built across different historical periods. On this reading, recurring themes exist because later prophetic voices preserved, expanded, and reinterpreted older Isaianic material. The differences between Assyrian crisis, Babylonian exile, and restored Jerusalem are real, and any responsible reading must preserve them. But a history of composition does not settle the meaning of the completed scroll. An anthology can still be shaped. Earlier words can be placed where later words answer them. Images can recur with deliberate transformation. The final book can make claims no individual oracle makes alone. The strongest evidence appears at the two ends. Isaiah begins by summoning heaven and earth as witnesses to rebellion. Near its conclusion, God announces, "I create new heavens and a new earth." The witnesses called to observe the broken covenant are themselves renewed within the final vision. The book begins with Jerusalem compared to an abandoned shelter in a ravaged field. It ends with Jerusalem created for rejoicing. It begins with worship God refuses because violence fills the people's hands. It ends with all flesh coming to worship before the Lord. It begins with children who do not know their father. It ends with Zion giving birth and God comforting her children. It begins with a diseased body. Later, blind eyes open, deaf ears hear, the lame leap, and the wounded servant bears the sickness and guilt of others. These are not 66 secret correspondences with 66 later books. They are relationships inside Isaiah itself. The scroll's ending reaches backward and changes how its opening is heard. The title, Vision of Isaiah, therefore names more than a sequence of predictions. The book presents a world scene under the rule of the Holy One of Israel. In that world, pride is brought low, false worship is exposed, empires are judged, a remnant survives, and creation moves toward renewal. But this discovery creates a harder question. If Isaiah's opening problem is rebellion, injustice, and uncleanness, how can the book arrive at a new creation without simply ignoring the guilt exposed in its first chapters? The promised king can establish justice. A new exodus can bring exiles home. Neither action by itself explains how the guilt of the vineyard is removed. For that, the investigation must follow a figure whose identity seems to move between Israel and one obedient representative, the servant of the Lord. Isaiah first identifies the servant plainly. "You, Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen." The servant is the covenant people. Israel was called from the descendants of Abraham, carried through the history, and appointed to bear witness that the Lord alone is God. This reading is not an interpretation imposed from outside. The book states it directly, but it immediately creates a tension. The servant who should witness is blind. The messenger who should hear is deaf. Israel has received instruction, but has not obeyed it. The nation chosen to reveal God has repeated the same failure exposed in Isaiah's opening chapters. Then Isaiah 42 introduces a servant who appears different. God places his spirit upon him. He brings justice to the nations. He does not crush a bruised reed or extinguish a faintly burning wick. He becomes a covenant for the people and a light for the nations, opening blind eyes and releasing prisoners. The blind servant needs another servant who opens blind eyes. Isaiah 49 sharpens the distinction. The speaker is called Israel, yet he is also commissioned to bring Jacob back to God and gather Israel. His task cannot end there. God declares that restoring the tribes is too small a mission. The servant will become a light to the nations so that salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Israel and the servant are therefore connected without being simply interchangeable. The servant embodies Israel's calling, but he also acts for Israel because the nation has failed to fulfill that calling. The image resembles the relationship between a people and its representative. A king can embody his kingdom without being identical to every person within it. A priest can act for Israel while remaining one member of Israel. In Isaiah, the servant can carry the name and vocation of the nation while standing before God on the nation's behalf. This relationship reaches backward into the Exodus. God calls Israel his son and brings the people out of Egypt. He leads them through the sea, guides them through the wilderness, gives them instruction, and appoints them to be a priestly kingdom among the nations. Yet the wilderness generation repeatedly resists the God who delivers it. Isaiah describes the return from Babylon with the same imagery. A voice calls for a way to be prepared in the wilderness. God makes a road through the desert and waters in barren places. The redeemed leave captivity with joy, while creation itself participates in their return. But the second Exodus faces the same difficulty as the first. Removing Pharaoh did not remove rebellion from Israel. Leaving Babylon cannot, by itself, cleanse the people described in Isaiah's opening vision. A road can carry exiles back to Jerusalem, but it cannot make blind servants see. The servant must therefore accomplish something deeper than transportation. Isaiah 50 presents him as one instructed morning by morning. His ear is opened, and he does not rebel or turn backward. Where Israel heard without understanding, this servant listens. Where the nation resisted its calling, he obeys. His faithfulness is not protected from suffering. He gives his back to those who strike, and his face to shame and spitting. Then the poem moves toward its most difficult image. At the end of Isaiah 52, the servant is promised exaltation. He will act wisely and be raised high. Those words recall the language surrounding divine majesty elsewhere in Isaiah. Yet before that exaltation is understood, his appearance becomes appalling. The figure destined to be lifted up is first disfigured and rejected. Isaiah 53 allows a group of speakers to look back upon him. At first, they confess that they had judged him wrongly. They considered him struck by God because of his own condition. Then their interpretation changes. He was wounded for their transgressions. He was crushed for their iniquities. The punishment connected with their peace fell upon him. The poem shifts guilt from the sufferer to the speakers. The servant is not merely suffering beside the guilty. He is bearing what belongs to them. This language communicates with the sacrificial world of the Torah, but it does not duplicate one sacrifice exactly. The servant is compared to a lamb led to slaughter. He functions like a guilt offering. He bears iniquity and makes many righteous. Yet he is also a person who speaks, obeys, suffers unjustly, dies, and is afterward vindicated. The servant is priestly, sacrificial, prophetic, royal, and representative without being reduced to only one of those categories. The New Testament returns to this figure repeatedly. Matthew applies the gentle servant of Isaiah 42 to Jesus. Luke records Jesus citing Isaiah's servant language about being numbered with transgressors. 1 Peter describes Christ's innocence, wounds, and bearing of sins through the language of Isaiah 53. Acts makes the interpretive question explicit. An Ethiopian official is reading the passage about the silent sufferer led like a sheep to slaughter. He asks Philip, "About whom does the prophet say this? About himself or someone else?" Philip begins with that scripture and announces Jesus. The New Testament reading does not erase Israel from Isaiah. Jesus embodies Israel's vocation precisely because the servant passages already join the nation's identity to the work of an obedient representative. The one faithful servant restores the servant people and extends Israel's light toward the nations. But one unresolved problem remains. Isaiah 53 can explain how guilt is born. It can explain why the servant suffers despite innocence. It can even describe his death and subsequent vindication. What it has not yet explained is how one rejected servant becomes the turning point between a ruined Jerusalem and a new creation. The answer appears when two figures often studied separately, the promised Davidic king and the suffering servant, are placed on the same prophetic road. The royal child and the suffering servant are never explicitly introduced as the same person within Isaiah. That distinction matters. The promised ruler comes from David's house. Authority rests upon him. The Spirit equips him to judge with righteousness. The servant, however, emerges from Israel's calling. He obeys, suffers rejection, bears iniquity, and becomes light to the nations. One figure appears crowned with government. The other is led like a lamb to slaughter. If those portraits are forced together too quickly, Isaiah's own development disappears. But if they remain completely separate, another pattern becomes impossible to explain. Both figures accomplish what failed Israel could not. The Davidic ruler establishes the justice missing from God's vineyard. The servant embodies the obedience missing from God's people. The ruler defends the poor. The servant refuses violence and deceit. The ruler carries the Spirit. The servant also carries the Spirit. The ruler extends knowledge of God across the earth. The servant extends salvation to its ends. Their missions converge even before their identities are settled. Then one repeated expression brings the portraits closer. In Isaiah 6, the Lord is seated upon a throne, high and lifted up. At the beginning of the final servant poem, God declares that his servant will prosper, be high and lifted up, and greatly exalted. The wording does not make the servant identical to God by grammar alone. Isaiah can use exaltation language in more than one setting, but the deliberate echo places the servant's destiny within the book's language of extraordinary glory. And the next line overturns every expectation of what that glory should look like. The servant is disfigured. Nations are startled. Kings become silent. The one promised exaltation reaches it through degradation. Isaiah's royal hope has prepared the reader to expect victory through righteous rule. The servant reveals that the road to that victory passes through suffering, rejection, and the bearing of guilt. The king cannot merely defeat Israel's enemies. The servant must deal with Israel's sin. This is the intermediate reversal at the center of the scroll. The greatest obstacle to restoration is not Assyria. It is not Babylon. It is not ruined walls, empty fields, or political weakness. It is the rebellion carried by the people themselves. Assyria can be driven away. Babylon can be overthrown. Cyrus can authorize a return. Stones can be placed back upon stones. None of those acts can, by itself, transform the vineyard's fruit. Isaiah had already exposed this problem through Hezekiah. He is one of Judah's most faithful kings. He trusts God during the Assyrian threat, receives deliverance, and survives mortal illness. Yet, when Babylonian envoys arrive, he displays his treasures and weapons. His reign ends with the announcement of future exile. Even a faithful son of David cannot carry the book to its conclusion. The royal promise remains, but it must pass beyond every ordinary king. The servant promise remains, but it must pass beyond Israel in its blindness. Isaiah's hope now requires someone who can embody Israel, fulfill Davidic justice, carry the Spirit, bear guilt, survive death's verdict, and extend salvation to the nations. The New Testament does not create this convergence from nothing. It enters a tension already built into Isaiah's final form. Matthew presents Jesus as the Son of David and the child called Emmanuel. He also identifies him as Isaiah's gentle servant, upon whom the Spirit rests. Luke announces a Davidic king whose reign will have no end. Later, Jesus reads Isaiah's words about the Spirit-anointed herald who brings good news to the poor and declares the passage fulfilled. John describes Isaiah seeing the glory of Jesus after quoting both the servant's rejected message and the prophet's throne vision. The royal and servant lines meet in one person, but they meet in a way the disciples themselves struggle to accept. They can imagine a Messiah who reigns. They resist a Messiah who suffers. Isaiah had placed those truths upon the same prophetic road long before the gospel narratives reveal how the road reaches Jerusalem. The convergence also changes the meaning of victory. If the Messiah merely destroys hostile nations, the deepest enemy remains inside the covenant people. If he merely suffers as an innocent victim, the promised reign remains unexplained. Isaiah's complete hope requires suffering that accomplishes restoration and exaltation that establishes righteous rule. This is why the servant's silence before his oppressors cannot be mistaken for defeat. The poem begins with his promised exaltation before describing his humiliation. The outcome is announced first, so that the suffering will be interpreted as the path, not the collapse of his mission. After being cut off from the land of the living and assigned a grave, the servant sees the result of his anguish. He bears the sin of many and intercedes for transgressors. Death enters the poem, but death does not retain the final word over him. Isaiah does not narrate the event as the Gospels later narrate the resurrection. The prophetic poem speaks through compressed and debated language. Some ancient textual witnesses explicitly contain the word light in the line about what the servant sees after his suffering. The traditional Masoretic wording is shorter. Either form moves from death toward vindication, offspring, and accomplished purpose. The servant's work then transforms the chapters that follow. Immediately after his suffering, barren Zion is told to sing. The woman without children will receive more children than expected. Her tent must be enlarged. Her shame will be removed. Her maker is called her husband and her redeemer. That placement is crucial. Isaiah does not move randomly from a suffering man to a joyful city. The servant bears guilt. and therefore Zion's future opens. His affliction becomes the threshold of her restoration. The vineyard that produced corrupt fruit can now be replanted. The abandoned woman can become a mother. The ruined city can receive children. The covenant of peace can stand. But this reversal produces a new question. If Zion is restored through the servant's work, who belongs inside her enlarged tent? Only the descendants returning from Babylon? Or does the servant's mission to the ends of the earth change the boundaries of the restored people themselves? Isaiah 54 commands Zion to enlarge her tent because unexpected children are coming. The next chapters identify some of them. Foreigners who join themselves to the Lord are told not to say, "The Lord will surely separate me from his people." Eunuchs, whose condition could exclude them from full participation under earlier legal arrangements, receive a place and a name within God's house, better than sons and daughters. The restored temple is to become a house of prayer for all peoples. This is not the disappearance of Israel. The promise is spoken to Zion, grounded in Israel's covenant language and announced by Israel's prophet. But the restored people cannot be defined simply as the same population returning to the same land. The servant's mission has widened the horizon. Foreigners come not as distant spectators, but as worshipers joined to the Lord. That vision meets resistance inside the restored community. The final chapters of Isaiah appear to address conditions associated with Judah after exile, when return had not produced the glorious transformation earlier promises seemed to describe. Jerusalem existed again. Worship had resumed, yet injustice, conflict, corrupt leadership, and idolatrous practices remained. Geographic return had occurred. Spiritual restoration remained incomplete. Isaiah 58 exposes the contradiction through fasting. The people seek God and ask why he has not noticed their religious devotion. The prophetic answer points toward oppression, quarreling, violence, and neglect of the hungry and homeless. The fast God chooses loosens the bonds of wickedness. It shares bread with the hungry, brings the poor into the house, and covers the naked. Only then does the promise say that light will break forth like the dawn. The opening accusation of Isaiah has returned. Worship cannot conceal blood-stained hands. Religious observance cannot substitute for justice. The restored city is capable of repeating the rebellion of the city that went into exile. That means Babylon was never the deepest prison. A decree from Cyrus can release captives from imperial territory. It cannot release the human heart from false worship. Rebuilt gates cannot prevent truth from stumbling in the public square. A restored altar cannot make every sacrifice acceptable. Isaiah 59 describes the crisis without softening it. Justice is far away. Truth has fallen. The Lord sees that there is no one to intervene. Then God acts. He puts on righteousness like armor and salvation like a helmet. He comes as Redeemer to Zion and establishes a covenant in which his spirit and his words remain with his people. The imagery joins themes that have been developing across the scroll. The divine warrior defeats evil. The Redeemer restores the family. The Spirit who rested upon the promised ruler and the servant now remains with a covenant people whose own strength could not complete the restoration. Zion is then commanded to arise and shine because her light has come. Nations travel toward that light. Exiles return. Gates remain open. The city, once abandoned, becomes the center of a worldwide gathering. But the nations do not enter Isaiah's vision in only one way. Some texts describe them coming peacefully to learn God's instruction. Others portray their wealth and kings serving Zion. Still others announce severe judgment against nations that resist God's reign. The tension should not be erased. Isaiah's universal hope is not the claim that every nation remains unchanged and is automatically approved. Pride is brought down. Violence is judged. Idols are exposed. The nations are gathered through the victory of Israel's God, not through indifference to rebellion. Yet judgment is not the whole relationship. Earlier, Isaiah spoke an extraordinary blessing over Israel's historic enemies. Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Egypt, the land of ancient bondage, and Assyria, the empire threatening Isaiah's world, are imagined within a threefold blessing. The goal is not merely for Israel to take the place of its oppressors. The enemies themselves must be transformed. This is why the servant's light matters. Military victory can silence a hostile king. It cannot make hostile peoples worship the Holy One of Israel. The servant reaches the nations through justice, instruction, suffering, and salvation. Isaiah 61 brings these lines together in another Spirit-anointed figure. The Spirit of the Lord is upon him to announce good news to the poor, bind the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to captives, comfort mourners, and rebuild ruined places. The passage uses language of release, resembling the Jubilee legislation of the Torah. Land, liberty, debt, inheritance, and restored community belong to its world. But the announcement reaches beyond one legal observance. Zion's mourners receive a new identity, and ruined generations are rebuilt. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus reads this passage in the synagogue at Nazareth and declares that it has been fulfilled in the hearing of the assembly. The reaction initially appears favorable. Then Jesus recalls divine mercy reaching a widow in Sidon and Naaman the Syrian during the days of Israel's prophets. The assembly becomes enraged. Isaiah's widened tent remains a point of conflict. The gospel scene does not introduce Gentile inclusion as an unrelated later idea. It reveals how offensive Isaiah's own horizon can become when familiar promises are claimed by those expected to remain outside. The same tension continues in Acts. When Paul and Barnabas announce their mission among the Gentiles, they cite the servant's commission to be a light to the nations and carry salvation to the ends of the earth. The servant's vocation extends through his witnesses, but this creates the final major opposition. If Isaiah's promises can move from Israel's servant to Jesus, and from Jesus to his commissioned witnesses, has Israel's place in the prophecy been erased? Or does the New Testament's use of Isaiah depend upon Israel's story remaining essential? The answer lies in the way Isaiah joins three images that cannot be separated: the remnant, the root of Jesse, and the gathered nations. Isaiah's remnant is never a replacement for Israel. It is Israel preserved through judgment. The image appears early. Cities may be emptied and the land devastated, but a stump remains. Isaiah's own son bears the name Shir Jashub. A remnant shall return. Later, the survivors of Jacob are described as no longer leaning upon the empire that struck them, but upon the Holy One of Israel. The remnant proves two truths at once. God's judgment is real. God's promise has not failed. This distinction becomes decisive in Paul's letter to the Romans. Faced with the question of Israel's unbelief, Paul repeatedly turns to Isaiah. Though Israel's descendants were as numerous as the sand, Isaiah had said that only a remnant would be saved. Paul does not use that passage to declare Israel irrelevant. He uses it to explain how covenant faithfulness can continue through judgment without reducing God's word to failure. Paul himself becomes part of the evidence. He identifies as an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin and asks whether God has rejected his people. His answer is immediate: by no means. The remnant remains, but Isaiah's second image prevents the remnant from becoming a closed circle. A shoot rises from Jesse's stump. Eventually, Isaiah speaks not merely of a branch growing from the root, but of the root of Jesse standing as a signal for the peoples. The nations seek him. The surviving root of David's house becomes the gathering point for the world. Paul quotes that promise when describing Jews and Gentiles glorifying God together. The Messiah does not make Israel's story unnecessary. He fulfills the Davidic hope within Israel's story, and that fulfillment becomes the reason the nations can enter its promised blessing. The direction matters. The nations do not receive salvation because Israel has vanished. They receive it because the root of Jesse has risen. Isaiah's vineyard, servant, king, remnant, and nations now converge. The failed vineyard requires righteous fruit. The blind servant requires an obedient representative. The fallen dynasty requires a living root. The scattered people require a remnant. The distant nations require a signal. The Messiah stands where those lines meet. This also explains why Isaiah can be quoted at nearly every major threshold of the gospel story. At the birth of Jesus, Matthew hears Emmanuel and the light dawning in Galilee. At the beginning of the public ministry, all four Gospels hear the wilderness voice preparing the way of the Lord. When Jesus heals and withdraws from public acclaim, Matthew hears the servant who does not quarrel or crush the bruised reed. When parables produce both revelation and resistance, the Gospels return to Isaiah's commission about hearing without understanding. When Jesus enters suffering, Isaiah's rejected and wounded servant becomes essential. When the mission moves outward, Acts returns to the servant's light, reaching the ends of the earth. These are not isolated predictions accidentally gathered from one long scroll. The New Testament writers recognize the same movement Isaiah has been building. The Lord returns, the servant acts, blindness is exposed, guilt is borne, Israel is gathered, and the nations receive light. For those who have remained through this investigation, thank you. Subscribe if you want to continue examining Scripture through its textual and historical connections. And thank you to everyone who supports these studies. One final piece of evidence carries the pattern to the end of the canon. Revelation's closing vision does not merely borrow Isaiah's phrase, "new heavens and a new earth." It gathers an entire network of Isaianic images. The holy city shines with divine glory. Nations walk by its light. Kings bring their honor into it. Its gates remain open. Mourning and weeping pass away. God's servants receive a new name. The former creation gives way to the world God makes new. Isaiah 60 had already described Zion arising because her light had come. Nations would travel toward that brightness. Gates would remain open, and the sun would no longer be the city's light, because the Lord would be its everlasting light. Isaiah 65 had already announced new heavens and a new earth, a Jerusalem created for joy, and the end of former distress. Revelation receives those promises and centers them upon God and the Lamb. The relationship also moves backward. Revelation shows how early Christian readers understood Isaiah's restored Zion, not as an isolated return to the conditions before exile, but as the final dwelling of God with a redeemed people drawn from the nations. Yet Revelation preserves Isaiah's judgment as well as his consolation. Proud Babylon falls. The city that glorifies itself is exposed and destroyed. The servants of God rejoice, but rebellion does not enter the new city unchanged. Isaiah's two cities have reached their final contrast. One city is built upon arrogance, violence, wealth, and self-exaltation. The other receives its light from God. This is the decisive evidence that Isaiah's role cannot be explained by the number of its chapters. Its language helps the Bible move from Genesis to Revelation because Isaiah takes the earliest biblical tensions and carries them toward their final horizon. Creation has rebelled, so a new creation is required. Humanity hides in pride, so the Holy One brings pride low. Israel fails in its vocation, so the obedient servant embodies and restores it. David's tree is cut down, so the root of Jesse rises. The nations rage, so they are judged and gathered toward light. The land becomes desolate, so a highway opens through the wilderness. The city becomes unfaithful, so Zion must be redeemed and remade. The numerical theory offered a pattern imposed upon Isaiah from outside. The scroll itself has now revealed a far stronger pattern from within. But one question remains before the opening image can be read again. If Isaiah truly reaches from rebellious creation to renewed creation, What is the single path connecting the courtroom of its first chapter to the worship of its last? The path is holiness, moving through judgment toward redemption. Isaiah's opening courtroom is not abandoned when the book reaches comfort. Its accusations remain true. The children rebelled. The vineyard produced bloodshed. The city became unfaithful. Worship continued while justice disappeared. Comfort does not arrive because the evidence has been dismissed. It arrives because God acts upon the guilt the courtroom exposed. The Holy One judges the proud city, preserves a remnant, and promises a righteous ruler. He opens a highway through the wilderness, brings captives out of Babylon, and reveals that geographic return is not enough. He appoints an obedient servant where the servant people had been blind. That servant bears the iniquity of many, and barren Zion is told to enlarge her tent. The city is not merely rebuilt, it is given a new future. This is why Isaiah's name for God matters so deeply. The Holy One of Israel appears throughout the scroll. Holiness is not a decorative attribute surrounding divine power. It is the uncompromised identity of the God who cannot call bloodshed righteousness or idolatry worship. Yet the title also includes a relationship, the Holy One of Israel. The God who exposes Israel's corruption remains the one who calls himself her Redeemer. He does not solve the covenant crisis by becoming less holy, nor by discarding every promise. Redemption must satisfy the truth revealed in judgment. The servant stands at that meeting point. He does not break a bruised reed, but he establishes justice. He does not practice violence, yet violence falls upon him. He bears guilt without making guilt imaginary. He is cut off, yet his purpose succeeds. Through him, the blind servant people can again become witnesses. The promised king stands there as well. The spirit-filled shoot from Jesse does not rule like Assyria. He does not secure his throne through terror, tribute, or boasting. He judges with righteousness, defends the poor, and becomes a signal for the nations. His kingdom answers the political arrogance Isaiah confronted in his own century. The New Testament joins those portraits in Jesus because Isaiah had already shown why both are necessary. A king without the servant might defeat enemies while leaving guilt untouched. A servant without the king might suffer faithfully without establishing the promised reign. In Jesus, the servant bears sin, and the Davidic Messiah rises to rule. That is why Isaiah appears wherever the gospel story changes direction. The wilderness voice announces that Israel's God is coming. Emmanuel names divine presence. The servant explains quiet mercy and rejected testimony. The wounded figure interprets the cross. The root of Jesse explains hope for the nations. Zion's light opens toward the final city. Isaiah is not predicting the table of contents of a later-bound Bible. Isaiah is supplying the language by which that Bible explains its central movement. The great Isaiah scroll makes the difference visible. Copied before the time of Jesus, it preserves essentially the entire book across more than 7 meters of parchment. Its ancient scribes used textual divisions, but not the medieval 66-chapter system. The scroll was already one great prophetic witness before the numerical comparison could exist. Its unity does not require every oracle to come from the same historical moment. Assyrian danger, Babylonian exile, Persian-era restoration, and later canonical reception can remain distinct. The composition of Isaiah is complex, and major scholarly questions remain debated. But the completed book places those horizons into conversation. The ending answers the beginning. The servant answers the blind servant. The root answers the stump. The new Exodus answers exile. The accepted worship of the nations answers the rejected worship of blood-stained Jerusalem. New creation answers the heaven and earth summoned to court. That is the real key. Isaiah gathers the Bible's great unresolved tensions and refuses to solve them cheaply. Judgment does not cancel promise. promise does not excuse injustice. Israel's election does not exclude the nations. The gathering of nations does not erase Israel. Kingship does not eliminate servanthood. Suffering does not prevent exaltation. Exile does not become the final home. Death does not keep the final word. The book's first vision of worldwide peace can now be heard more clearly. Nations stream toward the mountain of the Lord. They come to learn his ways. Swords become plowshares because divine instruction transforms how peoples live beneath God's rule. The road to that mountain passes through the entire scroll. It passes the vineyard. It passes the stump. It crosses the wilderness. It reaches the servant's grave. It enters the enlarged tent of Zion, and it ends beneath new heavens and a new earth. If this investigation clarified Isaiah's place in Scripture, subscribe or follow. Share this video with 5 people who have heard the claim about Isaiah's 66 chapters. In the comments, name the detail that stood out most: the medieval chapter numbers, the servant and Israel, the root of Jesse, or Isaiah's new creation imagery, and suggest the next prophetic book that should be examined. The number 66 may be the detail that first draws attention to Isaiah, but the ancient scroll does not ask to be counted like a table of contents. It asks heaven and earth to listen. At the beginning, they listen as witnesses against a rebellious people. At the end, they have been made new,